Hi, Blue Jays. Mrs. Parsons from Blades Elementary School. I'm here to continue our journey. Hold on. With The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. I hope you all have enjoyed the book so far. We're going to continue today with chapter 13, The Restless Inventor. That January, the students returned to school at Catchacolo. I sat on the road one morning listening to them laugh and joke and talk about their friends and teachers, and when they passed, I went to my room and closed the door. I still saw Gilbert and the others for games of balo, and when they said things like, "So, William, when shall we see you at school again?" or boasted about their grades, I said nothing and simply told them I'd rather not talk about it. After a while, no one did. It was around then that I noticed the ghosts, not real ghosts, but boys who dropped out of school and now loitered in the trading center without purpose. I'd see them outside the dry goods store in their bare feet and grimy clothes, waiting for small jobs so they could spend all night in the bar rooms. In Malawi, we say these people are grooving through life, just living off ganyu with no plans for the future. I started worrying that soon I'd become them. I worried that one day the windmill would no longer excite me, or it would become too difficult to maintain, and the maze rows or boozing dens would slowly swallow me up. It was easy to lose hold of your dreams. I battled this darkness by trying to keep a positive mindset. Every week I returned to the library just to continue learning and stay inspired. I read all the novels and spelling books and practiced my English. And I continued checking without explaining physics, using energy, and integrated science, and researching other ways to help my family. Because the windmill had been such a success, I was feeling pressure to do something bigger. I began to see myself much like a famous reggae star who just released a #1 album and now had to produce another one. The fans were waiting, at least I thought they were. So each day at the library, I flipped through the books looking for the next big idea. Many people who came to see my windmill kept saying the same thing. "This looks like an antenna." Or, "If you could make this electric wind, you could make one of those. That's what it looks like anyway." This made me curious about how an antenna actually worked. And after thinking about it for a while, I went to Jeffrey with an idea. "Ah, these people are always calling our windmill an antenna. So let's give them what they want." "What do you mean?" "Let's build a radio station." That afternoon, we rummaged through our bag of parts and found 2 junker radios that didn't even have covers attached. I wanted to test a theory. One night, a few weeks before, there'd been a big thunderstorm. I was in my room listening to the Sunday Top 20 when a huge crack of lightning exploded and caused a blip on my program, as if the lightning had sliced through my signal. So taking the 2 radios, I tuned one to a static frequency, then took the second and tuned it to the same place on the dial. When this happened, the second radio went silent. No static, nothing. Was the frequency from one radio penetrating the other, just like the lightning bolt? If that was true, surely I could put my own voice on top of that frequency and let it ride into the next radio. One of the radios I was using was a Walkman with both AM, FM, and cassette player. So leaving the first radio tuned to static, I took the Walkman and switched it to tape mode. I noticed that wires ran from the tape head to the speakers, so I unhooked and reconnected them to the player's condenser, which controls the frequency. Perhaps music meant for the speakers could instead catch a ride on a frequency wave straight into its fellow radio. I put Black Missionaries tape in the deck. "Here it goes," I said. I pressed play, and sure enough, the music played loud and clear in the other radio. The Walkman was my transmitter, and meaning that if I had 5 radios tuned to the same frequency, they'd all be playing the Black Missionaries. "Now, Mr. Jeffrey," I said, "how can I do this with my voice?" I unhooked the wires from the condenser and reconnected them to a separate speaker, which I'd broken off a pair of headphones, turning it into a microphone. I pressed play again and started talking into the mic. 1, 2, 1, 2, I said. I could hear my voice coming from the other player. Good afternoon, Malawi. This is your host, William Kamkwamba, along with my trusty sidekick, Mr. Jeffrey. Your regularly scheduled program has been interrupted. After that, Jeffrey and I began experimenting with our little radio station. Jeffrey walked outside with the radio while I stayed in my room and started singing his favorite Billy Conga song. Even outside, Jeffrey could hear my voice clearly. I held nothing back. After a while, he shouted, "My ears are bleeding, but please carry on. This is cool." But the farther I got from the further he got from my bedroom, the weaker the signal. After 300 feet, it completely disappeared, which was probably good for Jeffrey on account of my lousy voice. If we only had an amplifier, we could broadcast to greater distances, I said. But Jeffrey was scared we'd be arrested for messing with the government's frequencies. People kept saying the same nonsense about my windmill. You better be careful, or ESCOM will come and arrest you. If the first people to experiment with great inventions, such as radios, generators, or airplanes, had been afraid of being arrested, we'd never be enjoying those things today. Let them come arrest me, I told them. It would be an honor. Soon I was attacking every idea with an experiment. Over the course of the next year, I was constantly planning and devising some new scheme. And while the windmill and radio station had been a success, I couldn't say the same for other ventures. The project I was most excited about was a water pump, which had been part of my original idea that day at the library. Just as I'd done with my windmill, I first designed an experimental pump so I could play around with the concept. I modeled it after a picture and explaining physics of a standard force pump, which used a piston and series of valves to push water through an outlet. The best example was the hand pumps my mother and sisters used in Wimby to get our water. My goal was to build a pump over the shallow well at our house. It was nothing but a 40-foot hole where we took water for washing clothes and floors. It wasn't clean enough to drink. The only way to get the water was by using a long rope and a bucket. To pump water, I'd need a pipe and one that was long enough to reach the bottom of the well. Just a few days earlier, I'd stumbled over some irrigation pipes buried in the ground at the scrapyard that I must have overlooked. Taking my hoe, I went one morning and dug them up. The first was a wide PVC pipe, which I used as my outer barrel. I placed it down the well until I felt it hit the bottom. The second pipe was metal and slightly thinner, perfect for my piston. Mr. Godsten then welded a round metal washer to the end of the pipe and left its center hole open. Around the washer, I attached a thick piece of rubber that acted as a seal. I then had Godsten bend the top of the pipe to make a handle. When the metal pipe was pushed up and down, it created kind of a vacuum inside of the outer PVC pipe. When you pulled up, the water sucked into the plastic pipe, and when you pushed down, the rubber seal opened and pushed the water to the surface and then out a small hole into a bucket. But the problem was the rubber valve created too much friction against the plastic pipe. My mother and sisters tried using the pump along with some other women, but they found it too difficult to operate. I can't manage this thing, my mother said. Feels stuck. I tried greasing the pipe, but the cold water made the grease too thick and clumpy. After a while, I gave up. The pump was a failure, but it was nothing compared to my attempt to create biogas. As I mentioned earlier, deforestation in Malawi had made it difficult to find firewood for cooking, and gathering wood only adds to this destructive cycle. A good harvest of maize usually gave us enough dried cobs to burn for about 4 months, but once those were finished, the hunt for wood began. In addition to fetching water in Wimby, my mother and sisters routinely walked 2 miles to the small blue gum forest near Cachacolo to cut down a bundle of thin trees, a chore that took at least 3 hours. This wood was still green, and burning it produced thick white smoke that poured out from our kitchen windows. Looking inside, I see my poor mother stirring the pot in a sema, squeezing her eyes closed as tears ran down her cheeks. All the girls in my family develop nasty coughs each year. In Malawi, this was every woman's burden, and I knew these journeys to find wood would only get longer and longer, plus the deforestation would only create more devastating droughts and floods. Someone had to save the women and the trees, and I thought, why not me? Ever since I built the windmill, women asked me, does electric wind allow your mother to cook? The answer was no. The windmill didn't supply enough voltage to power a hot plate, much less an electric stove or oven. But a few weeks earlier, I was experimenting with wires and batteries and struck upon an idea. I took a long piece of copper wire and wrapped it around 20 times of a thick piece of grass, the kind we use to build roofs and fences. I connected both ends to a 12-volt battery and felt it heat up. Soon the wire was glowing red hot, and the grass caught fire in my hands. It was a simple, kind of stupid experiment, but it had me thinking, maybe something like this could boil water. I couldn't place a metal pot on a coil of wire because it acted as a conductor. A clay pot was too heavy and would crush the coil. So I built a kind of magic wand using an empty ballpoint pen. These kinds of coils existed already. I'd seen them in the training center, but they were powered by Escom electricity. I connected mine to a 12-volt battery and dipped the coil into the water. In about 5 minutes, it was boiling. But this was too simple. I had to go bigger. My integrated science book had a small section on alternative fuels, such as solar and hydro, both of which I had studied. But it also mentioned something called biogas, which was made by converting animal poop into fuel to use for cooking. The book described a long process to get this gas. First, you had to bury the poop in a pit, then wait months and months before the gas could be tapped with a valve. But I couldn't be bothered. I don't need a pit, I thought, and I certainly don't need to wait that long. As I devised my plan, I snuck into my mother's kitchen and snatched the round clay pot she used for making beans. Now, all I needed was the organic matter, as the book described it. I didn't have to look far. Across the compound, Aunt Chrissy kept 2 goats in a wooden pen behind her house, and the ground was covered in marble-shaped poop. Taking a sugar bag, I made sure nobody was looking, and I climbed over the fence. I filled the sack until it was spilling over and walked back to the kitchen. My mother was busy in the garden, which gave me plenty of time to work. First, I dumped the poop into the pot, filled it halfway with water, causing the brown grassy balls to bop and float. I then covered the pot, the plastic jumbo bag, and tied a rope around the lips, sealing it tight. For my valve, I clipped the top of a radio antenna and poked a shallow hole through the center of the plastic. Lastly, I corked the top with a reed. My mother's fire was still warm from breakfast, so I added a handful of maize cobs until the coals caught life. I placed the pot in the center and waited for greatness. Kamkwamba, I said to myself, you've really done it this time. In a few minutes, I heard a rumbling inside the pot, and the water began to boil. The plastic puffed and danced from the steam, but the rope held tight. My heart began to flutter. I'd give it a few more seconds before initiating the final test. That's when my mother came in. "What's that smell?" she shouted. I stammered, "Biogas? It's horrible. What are you doing in here?" I had no time to explain. By now, the plastic was rumbling like mad, ready to blow. I had to act quickly. It was time to remove the reed and proceed with ignition. I reached over and uncorked the valve, and when I did, a pipe of silver gas came rushing out the top. My mother was right. It did smell terrible. I grabbed a long piece of grass, that I'd set aside and poked it into the fire, catching a flame. I stood up and ran to the door, pushing my mother aside. "Stand back," I shouted. "This could be dangerous." "What?" With half my body protected by the door frame, I thrust the flame torch towards the valve and shielded my eyes for the blast. But when the fire touched the gas, all it did was fizzle and die. I was left holding a wet piece of grass and dripping with poopy water. My mother was furious. She dragged me out of the kitchen yelling, "Look what you've done. You've ruined my best pot, boiling goat poop. Wait till I tell your father." I tried to tell her it was for her own sake, but I guess it wasn't the right time. In 2006, when I was 18 years old, another famine struck Malawi. That year, thanks to a change of government, my family had been able to buy a few bags of fertilizer. At first, the rains came like they normally did. We planted our seeds and waited for them to show their faces, then added a spoonful of fertilizer and a lot of prayer. By January, the seedlings were ankle high and showing their little arms, so happy to be drinking up such delicious rain. But just the time they reached my father's knees, the rain stopped completely. By the time the dow season arrived, most of the ears were deformed. The government quickly promised help, but in the meantime, people grew angry and scared. During the famine in 2001-2002, people blamed the corrupt officials who'd sold off our surplus. By this time, instead of acknowledging the weather, they blamed magic, and that meant blaming me. Superstitions were still very strong throughout the country, and several incidences in the news has stirred fear even more. During the previous famine, we heard lots of reports of vampires stealing people's body parts and selling them. Following the vampires, a strange beast appeared in Dawa and began attacking villages. Some said it looked like a hyena. Others, it said it was like a lion with the face of a dog. The attacks caused thousands to flee their homes and sleep in the forest, where they were even more vulnerable to this exotic creature. The police conducted all-night searches. Then one evening, they managed to corner the beast in a thicket and opened fire with their rifles. But instead of falling dead, the beast split into 3 separate animals and disappeared into the bush. Villagers summoned their Sanganga, who concocted a powerful potion and flung it into the trees. The next morning, the beast lay dead on the road, its single corpse no bigger than a dog. Later, it was discovered that the animal was the product of magic. A certain trader near Dawa had purchased some thunder and lightning from a powerful witch doctor and refused to pay for it. In retaliation, the wizard sent a monster against his village. These stories, however ridiculous, only increased people's fears in evil powers. So in 2006, when it looked as if another famine was coming, people blamed magic. For weeks, we'd gone without rain. Then finally one day in March, a giant storm cloud appeared in the distance. The sight of an oily black thunderhead was something to celebrate. "Look," people said, "today we'll have rain. Finally, we're saved." But as the clouds came overhead, a strong wind began to blow. It whipped the red dirt into our eyes and mouths and sent little cyclones tearing through the fields. Little by little, the storm drifted away without leaving a drop. With nothing but the scorching sun left in the sky, people gathered at my house and pointed up at my windmill. The blades were spinning so fast, the tower rocked and swayed. "Look, this giant fan has blown away our clouds. His machine is chasing away our rain. This machine is evil." "It's not a machine, it's a witch tower. This boy is calling witches." "Wait a second," I said. "The drought is all over the country. It's not just here. The electric wind is not the cause." "But we saw it with our own eyes," they said. I was afraid these people would return one day and tear down my windmill, or worse. All the next week, I stayed inside. I even stopped the blades during the day so they wouldn't raise more suspicions. At the trading center, people approached Gilbert. "You can tell us the truth," they said. "Is it true what he says about this electric wind? Or is he really a witch?" "He isn't a witch," Gilbert answered. "It's a windmill, a scientific machine. I helped build it." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. You've seen it for yourselves." Many of them had even used my windmill to charge their mobile phones. But placing the blame on me helped them overcome their fears about the famine. Luckily, not long after that, the government stepped in and released tons of maize on the market. A few months later, some aid agencies arrived and offered more assistance. No one starved or died. A catastrophe had been avoided. But still, it underlined the kind of backwardness in our people that really frustrates me. It's the end of chapter 13. I'm excited to see what the next chapter holds. See you tomorrow.